Here we are with Daniel, dare I say, Alamillo.
Correct. You're rarity. You're rarity in New York.
And we're here to talk about his experience with education in a poor and sort of politically marginalized community in New York, Bushwick, Brooklyn, and his view on education among young people from this community as a means of social and political activism. So Daniel, I'd like to know first what brought you into pursuing education as a professional?
Good question. I think it sort of started with, I guess, my parents stressing, specifically my dad stressing how important education was to getting out of the situation that we were in, meaning like poverty and working class family situation and just a city with a lot of crime.
And what city is that?
Santa Paula, California.
And is that where you're born and raised?
Yeah, north of Los Angeles, which is sort of like a community of immigrants, long-term Mexican Americans.
Mm-hmm. And is that what you identify as? Yeah, I mean, what are you, a first generation immigrant, second generation?
I'm fourth.
Wow.
Yeah, third on one side. So yeah, my family's been in Santa Paula for a long time, but they've kind of been trapped in this sort of system of poverty and working class. I mean, generations of construction workers, and none that were educated in a formal sense. Like, I was the first to go to college, and that was, I'd attribute to my parents, or specifically my dad. My mom somewhat, but I think my dad was always about education. So I always worked hard in school, regardless of like anything that I was going through, because I knew what I needed was not in that town. Like, for some reason, I was attracted to things that were very different from what the town had to offer.
Mm-hmm. So were you doing it were you working hard in school and pushing yourself in the realm of formal education, to satisfy your father's wishes, or your own, or because you just wanted to get the hell out of Santa Paula?
I think it was both. At least out of the fear of my father, I think it was because of my father, but then it grew into like, oh, this is what I really want. But then I realized that learning and education doesn't necessarily have to happen in school. And I think I started to realize that when I was like a teen, because I was learning a lot of things, like running around the streets and like hanging out with friends and stuff that I wasn't learning in school. That was still very important, a lot of social skills and learning different art forms, like music in particular. And then when I got out and I was in college, I sort of started to play with the idea of activism. Like, what does activism mean? How can it help with communities? How can I help my own community? You know, at times I would go back to Santa Paula during the summer and work in the library, working with kids and stuff. And I wasn't necessarily, at that point, still interested in education, because I was interested in history. Like, I was a history student. I studied history, but I was practicing education, and I didn't know it. And I didn't feel like I knew it until after I graduated, when I went back to Santa Paula and I became a substitute teacher. And substitutes get paid shit, like, compared to other teachers. Like, it's by the day, and unstable work, but I would be with the same kids like over and over and over because I was in the same school, and I felt like I was educating them, but I wasn't doing it formally because I wasn't a teacher. And then I traveled a little bit, and that kind of got me interested in just sort of like this education and what does education mean? How can I learn about it so I can teach it better?
How did traveling kind of spur your interest in education? And I imagine not just education broadly speaking, but education as a means of social change.
So I went to Tanzania.
Mm-hmm.
Tanzania, as East Africans would call it.
Mm-hmm. Was that part of your graduate program, or was that prior to it? Uh-huh.
My girlfriend at the time, ex-girlfriend now, she knew somebody who had worked in an orphanage in Tanzania. And so I kind of always had this desire to go to Africa. Maybe I read too much Malcolm X, or I don't know, Muhammad Ali, anybody who traced their roots back to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I like that idea. That Africa's where it all started. I mean, civilization started in Africa. Humans started in Africa. I want to figure out what's going on over there.
Mm-hmm.
So I went with her to this orphanage, and I saw sort of a lack of education. And it was very different from what it looks like in the U.S. In the U.S., it's sort of scaffolded into class, where you have the lower class have to go to public schools, upper class go to these really prestigious private schools, and they're very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
You have that to an extent in Tanzania, but you also have a limited amount of public schools and public school spaces for children. So all kids have the right to elementary education, but once you get to middle school and high school, or the upper levels, you had to test into it. If you didn't test into it, then you wouldn't be accepted into those public schools.
Wow.
So then you would just sort of like figure out stuff on your own. You would work in a shop, you would do your parents' trade, maybe they owned a shop, or they sewed, or they cooked, or cleaned. So when I met these orphans, a lot of them didn't have the support at home to test well. So they all were failing. And so me and some other people that were part of this organization helped to set up like a fundraiser, or sort of like a plan for those students that were failing. So we would pay for their education in private schools, and because nobody else was doing it, they were orphans. And I mean, that's patchwork, like activism, I guess. That's not sustainable because you still have this big problem. But I felt like that's the first thing that sort of started getting me to think about education internationally.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to bring that idea back home. And when I did, I started a master's program at NYU, thinking about like, oh, I'm going to change the world in East Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But that quickly changed.
And so what was this program that you pursued at NYU?
International education, which is full of a lot of students that are, well, I applied to NYU not really thinking about the idea of it being private.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not conscious of that at all. I was just like, I want to be in New York. I'm going to get to New York as fast as I can. And NYU was just that for me. And so I took a lot of loans out, and I'm like riddled in debt because of it. It's like I own a house, which I didn't buy. But now it's in my brain, I guess, because I got all this knowledge. But I got to NYU, and this program is international education. I was thinking I'm going to study East Africa. And I got there, and I realized a lot of the people here are full of shit.
How so? What do you mean by full of shit?
The people in my program were all interested in study abroad and exchange programs, which I felt are valuable because I participated in one later on and I got something out of it, and I realized that they're very valuable, but they're also part of this system of power that helps people that are privileged and doesn't necessarily help people that aren't privileged.
Right. So you were looking for a way to serve people on a more base level through education, right? In terms of just making sure that they have a means to a stable and full education all the way through all the levels, and for those people, you know, the working class or the unemployed or people in undeveloped countries, where they probably where the right to a secure education, you know, through all the levels is not a sure thing for them in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean,
so
there's definitely like this power dynamic. Okay, so people who have money or of a certain class, of a certain culture, of a certain nation globally, of a certain color, racially in some societies, they are privileged to have these opportunities of education, whereas others aren't. And I was coming from a place, being that my family was poor and working class, where they were Mexican, where they didn't necessarily speak the same language as the norm in this nation. Although they were American, they still were not given the same opportunities as a lot of people. For some reason, none of them went to college. And we're taught in this country that everyone should go to college, and for some reason people of color aren't doing it, and lower class people aren't doing it at the same rate. And I experienced this as a kid, and I saw it as a kid, so I felt like I'm going to learn more about what's happening there. Why is this happening? Who's benefiting? What's the cost? And I figured that out in my master's program, I think. And I say that people are full of shit in my master's program because a lot of them weren't aware of this.